All right, I think we will go ahead and get started as folks continue to join. Welcome again. Welcome to FACCC Budget and Legislative Webinar, the third in our series. If you're joining live, thank you for taking time out of your busy beginning of the semester schedule. We hope your semesters are off to a smooth start despite all of our challenges in this moment. If you're joining the recording, welcome. I'm Debbie Klein, President of FACCC, and we're here with Evan Hawkins, our Executive Director, and Stephanie Goldman, our Associate Director, and backed by popular demand, Dean Murakami, President of the Los Rios Federation of Teachers. Next slide, please. FACCC's mission is to inform, educate, empower, and advocate for faculty in service to students and the communities of California. We envision an educational environment that is equitable, accessible, and appropriately funded, and led by a diverse and empowered faculty. We also envision every faculty a member, every member an advocate, and every advocate informed. Next slide, please. At this moment, our nation and people across the globe are mourning another senseless shooting of another Black man, Jacob Blake, in Wisconsin. FACCC stands in solidarity with the peaceful protesters and the families and communities who are in mourning and demanding justice for Jacob Blake. I made this statement when George Floyd was murdered in the spring. Each Black student at our colleges and in our communities deserves the right to breathe, be free, and successful without fear of violence. FACCC encourages ongoing critical reflection and dialogue about systemic racism, social injustice, and racial and ethnic bias. We affirm the rights of Black students to be treated with respect and dignity within schools and communities. And now, next slide, please. And now shifting gears here to our agenda. We will start with an overview of the 2021 budget trailer bills. We'll move to a recap of 2020 legislation, and then we'll talk about some very important November propositions on our ballots and talk about some state and then local perspectives. And we'll have some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer your questions live at the end of the webinar. We'll conclude promptly at 3 p.m. and you can find this recorded webinar on our website. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to our very own Executive Director, Evan Hawkins.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. Looking forward to talking today a lot about the issues happening up here in Sacramento. We have the budget first that I'll be talking about a little bit here. So the budget obviously was signed at the end of June. However, there is always some what's called trailer bills that occur in the subsequent weeks, often to clean up some language within the budget, but additionally to make some usually smaller policy changes. So I wanted to touch on those. They're not very significant, but certainly worth noting. In the trailer bill language, we have two changes I'd like to highlight. The Lieutenant Governor will be serving on the California Community Colleges Board for moving forward. This is an interesting addition. This is the board that oversees the Chancellor's Office. The Lieutenant Governor also serves on the UC Regents and the CSU Board, so it makes sense to have that position serve on this board as well. So we look forward to working with the current Lieutenant Governor and any other Lieutenant Governor after that within that board. Additionally, there is updates within the trailer bill that made an update to the definition of what instructional materials means. Currently, instructional materials are defined as they were defined in the 90s and could use an update. Certainly nowadays, we have things like, we have Wi-Fi connectors that you can use from anywhere. You have hotspots, those sort of things that weren't even fathomable back then. So those are all added, which means that particularly when it comes to lottery funds, this is really what I wanted to highlight here. They are now able to be expanded in terms of what what lottery funds can be spent on due to this expanded definition of instructional materials. Stephanie Goldman will talk a little bit later about a bill that sort of expands it even more, FACC bill, but within the trailer bill language, instructional materials has changed. So I think that's important to note. I think the biggest thing we're waiting on with the budget right now is what happens in Washington, D.C. The state budget relies a lot on federal assistance, and it's federal assistance that hasn't happened yet. We initially anticipated this would occur last month in August, but Congress could not figure it out and could not figure out and come to an agreement on a stimulus plan. They are returning to session next week. Hopefully they will be able to figure something out. If not, there will be triggers that will impact community colleges. Essentially for us, it'll be mean more deferrals, but we're hoping that isn't the case. The federal money must arrive before October 15th. That's when the triggers will go into impact. So there's an important date there. So something for all of our FACC members, continue monitoring the weekly, and our social media will continue to have updates on that. Next slide, please. An update on the deferrals. I've shared this sort of consistently, but I think it's important to touch on. We have a significant amount of deferrals for our system in this current year. And certainly deferrals are better than cuts, and cuts is what we were looking at back in May. But deferrals are still challenging for districts nonetheless. But there is the expectation that with the money that will eventually come to districts, that districts will continue to serve students. This is an intention from the state to make sure that our districts don't close the doors for our students. We don't make the same mistakes we made during the last recession. And that's done very intentional. So these deferrals will be paid to our districts. Specifically, there's basically two chunks of it here. The first one is the $662 million, which is already in effect. And then there's 791 that will become deferrals, 791 million that will become deferrals if there is no federal support. So that's really where that October 15 deadline is so critical. Next slide, please. Additionally, there's been some changes and updates based on some new numbers that have come in that have impacted the state budget, what it looks like overall. And this has a lot to do with sort of what's happening locally and some other things that were not expected back when the budget was signed in June. The education protection funds, now that is money that was used to help offset some of the losses for education funding in our state. That ended up being adjusted down. There's not as much money that was expected there to help us out this year. So basically that's created a little bit of a loss there that was unexpected. A bigger loss, and I think the biggest issue that is going to cause this deficit factor that we're potentially looking at, is property tax revenues being lower than expected. And specifically in the Los Angeles area, Los Angeles County came in about 30 million less than expected, and what we expected in June, and that is offset pretty significantly, obviously LA being a large county, what was expected in revenues. Additionally, the reimbursement of student fees for students who had to drop out of courses in the spring, that's had an impact that wasn't necessarily expected when the budget conversations happened. As a result, the Chancellor's office is projecting a 1% to 2% deficit factor. Now, certainly not as large of a number as we were talking about when we were talking about cuts just a few months ago, but nonetheless, it's significant, especially because it's in addition to those deferrals that were mentioned. But nonetheless, the expectation is that districts continue to serve all students who come to our doors. And of course, that means that there has to be faculty positions there to teach those students, right? And that is FACC's message. And that's a message that we continue to relay to not only our state legislators, but where appropriate to our union and faculty leaders within their local districts as well. That's a key message that I've shared for folks across the state. And in addition to districts being able to tap into their reserves during this time, they can tap into their reserves and then get paid back by the state when the deferrals come. There are also an opportunity for them to borrow from the state treasurer's office in something that's called tax revenue anticipation notes. And I thought this was important for our faculty to know about locally when they're advocating and when they're hearing from their districts about potential cuts. There is an opportunity to borrow at a very low rate from the state treasurer's office, and it's called the Tran, T-R-A-N. So it's something worth having sort of in these conversations with districts. Certainly there is a cost to it, but there is options here for districts to tap into this to basically help them with cash flow issues for the year when it comes to deferrals. Next slide, please. And then finally, there's still work that's done in the fall. The legislature concluded its work on Monday, of course, and won't return unless there's a special session until January. During that time period, there's still much work to do. FAC will be interacting with the Chancellor's Office on the Chancellor's Office system budget request. Essentially, this is where the Chancellor's Office will send a letter outlining all of its funding priorities to the Department of Finance, and this helps guide the budget conversations come January. We are working hard now to make sure faculty priorities are included in that. Additionally, there's lots of work to be done in the fall with legislators to kind of get them thinking about what should be the priority when they come back to Sacramento in a few months. And even though we can't meet in person and probably won't be able to in the fall, these virtual meetings can be very effective, and we've done a number of them. And in some ways it can be even more effective, right? Because they're a lot more accessible. You can bring 10 people easily to a Zoom meeting. It's harder to bring 10 people across the city for a meeting at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday, right? So utilize this, reach out to your district offices, have conversations, tell them what's happening, what's the impact of COVID on your colleges, what's enrollment looking like, what do faculty need to be successful. Those sort of conversations will pay dividends in a couple months. And then January really is right around the corner. Of course, we have the election right in front of us, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But come January, we'll have another budget proposal from the governor, and it's going to be another challenging proposal. So we all need to be prepared for that, ready to go, and ready to advocate in January. So those are sort of the next budget steps. Stay tuned to our website or social media channels. We'll continue to do webinars and keep you updated. But that's kind of a recap and a snapshot of where we are with the budget right now. Next slide. So with that, I will hand it off to FAC Associate Director Stephanie Goldman.
Hey everybody, I wish I could see you all in person, but since I can't, this is the next best thing. So this was a pretty crazy year for the state legislature. They had an unexpected recess in spring because of COVID-19 issues, and then another one in the summer, an extended recess in the summer, again because of COVID-19 issues. And then we saw some interesting plays in the last week of the legislative session, which just ended. But FAC sponsored one bill this year. This was our primary bill. It was AB 2884 by Assemblymember Berman. And as Evan alluded to earlier, this bill would allow districts to use restricted lottery funds to provide housing and food assistance to students. So we did a lot of research last year in the fall and in the summer into lottery money, and what districts are doing with this money. And we discovered that there's quite a bit of this restricted lottery money that's actually going unused. So we came up with this idea. We worked very closely with Assemblymember Berman's office. And as we went through the legislative process this year, we actually have what's called an urgency clause added to it. And an urgency clause means that as soon as the governor signs it, if he does sign it, it'll go into effect. So we're not waiting until January. That requires a 2/3 vote by both houses, which we already had to have anyway because this was a lottery-related bill. So this bill passed the Senate floor last week. It went to Assembly concurrence on Sunday, passed that on Sunday, and it's now on its way to the governor. Next slide, please. So these were a couple of other bills that we were engaged in as co-sponsors. The Calbright audit passed in February, and that's, as it says, an audit for Calbright. The audit was scheduled to begin in July. We also co-sponsored AB 897, which was a Medina bill, which would have increased the part-time load maximum from 65-67% to 80-85%. That bill survived for quite a while this year. It was a 2-year bill. Initially, when the legislature came back from their extended spring recess, many of the legislators were told to cut their bill load significantly because of a condensed calendar. We just didn't have enough time for all of the bills that were introduced to go through the normal process. AB 897 actually survived that initial cutting, but it did not survive the cuts that were requested at the end of the extended summer recess. So in the end, it was killed because it was found to not directly relate to COVID or some of the other incredibly pressing issues that the state is facing right now. SB 777 would have required a district with less than 75% of its hours of credit instruction taught by full-time instructors to make an annual 5% reduction in the district's deficit. That one died earlier in the spring. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to touch on a couple of other bills that actually survived or have recently been in the news. One was AB 2101, and that was a big omnibus retirement bill with a lot of cleanup language in it impacting CalSTRS. That one ended up passing and is on its way to the government. AB 2416, which we supported, but we're not involved, we weren't co-sponsors or anything. That one is a super interesting one from Assemblymember Gabriel's office, and that would have required colleges to consider homelessness as an extenuating circumstances for students unable to meet satisfactory academic progress requirements at their institutions. That one again is on its way to the governor. There were two bills that were introduced late in the game, AB 1253, a Miguel Santiago bill. And that bill would have imposed additional taxes of 1%, 3%, 3.5% on taxable income over $1 million, $2 million, and $5 million. The reason that's appealing is because we need to do something. We need to raise revenue in the state. We had a major deficit. That unfortunately had a hearing. They didn't do a vote, and it did end up dying. AB 2088, a bonded bill, similarly would have imposed an additional 0.4% tax rate on income over $30 million, and that one also died in August. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, we are still incredibly busy here in Sacramento, even with the end of the legislative session. We have got the election coming up, and with any election, that means we're looking at propositions. There are two incredibly important propositions to our system on the ballot this year. The first is Proposition 16, which would end the 1996 ban on affirmative action. It would essentially appeal Proposition 209. And this would allow affirmative action for persons on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity to be considered for public employment, public education, and public contracts. This bill, or this proposition, was originally introduced in the Assembly as ACA 5 by Dr. Shirley Weber. And it passed both sides, both houses, as you can see, 30-10 in the Senate, 60-14. In fact, is now engaging with the campaign and collaborating with other partners on really trying to get this bill, or this proposition, passed by the voters in November. The other incredibly important proposition that's coming up on the ballots is Proposition 15. You might have heard of this one. It's the one that kind of pertains to the 1978 Proposition 13. And what this bill would, or what this proposition would do, is close the loop that was, or the loophole that was left open by the original Proposition 13 that allowed commercial and industrial properties to be taxed at the purchase price instead of what their actual market value is. This means that companies like Disney, IBM are being basically taxed at the rate that they were taxed at in 1978, plus a maximum 2% annual increase per year. This one's going to be a really tough lift. Business is funding the opposition campaign. There's all kinds of misinformation out there about this, a lot of misunderstanding, but ultimately it's an incredibly important proposition that would be a game changer, not just for our system, but for schools in California in general, as well as local communities. Next slide, please. So to support these propositions, in addition to voting for them, check out www.yes15.org. And for Prop 16, check out www.voteyesonprop16.org. I'd also like to note that the California Budget and Policy Center just came out with a brand new series on Proposition 15, which I highly recommend looking at. It really breaks down the taxes and sort of goes into the details. You can also join FACC's efforts and partner with us by emailing info@facc.org. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Stephanie and Evan. That was all really great information. And I'll just say a few words about some ongoing system-wide problems and let you all know and assure you that FACC continues to express our deep concern and make our points in the various venues where we are present. And in many ways, this thumbs down sad face summarizes our situation here. Our system has been plagued by bad policy, that is unnecessarily harming our students and colleges. The funding formula is not working. Yes, the legislature voted to extend the hold harmless provision through 2024, but what does that say about the formula? Under the guise of addressing systemic inequity, the formula was created with the goal of reducing the funding for our system, which is the unspoken goal held by many non-practitioner-based reform groups who support this formula. So here we go. The performance-based funding piece of the formula is failing. FACC has consistently advocated for the removal of performance-based funding from the formula. The research shows that performance-based funding does not work. In fact, it punishes the students and the colleges who need the most help. And then we have the districts in high-cost areas who are unfairly disadvantaged by this formula. So that's around a third of our colleges who are in this position and struggling. This means that the students, including students of color and low income in these colleges, are not being served. So basically, we have a funding formula that is creating inequitable outcomes as we speak. And FACC continues to ask, why are we still stuck with this formula? All right, so moving on to Calbright. First, I just wanted to thank all of you for your advocacy and activism last spring. We were effective. We educated and worked with our legislators, and they recommended to the governor the defunding and elimination of Calbright. We still hope the governor will listen. So I don't think I have to say this much to this audience, but I will just remind all of us that the 3 programs offered by Calbright are redundant, that now we have $15 million a year that could be reallocated to the other accredited colleges. We only have 500 or so students in Calbright. They have no faculty union and no academic senate. So next slide, please. We at FACC have written a letter to our governor, and as we speak, we are gathering signatures, and the letter is a very simple message to Governor Newsom. It's to follow the legislature's recommendation that Calbright be eliminated and that the funds be redirected to the other 115 colleges. And so we would love your support. If you would please sign the letter, you can reach it by this link here and go to our website and then pass it on to your networks. And basically, once we gather 10,000 signatures, our goal is to have a conversation with the governor. So thank you for that. And next slide, please. And now we are so thrilled to welcome our very own Dean Murakami. Many of you know Dean was a past president of FACC. He is a psychology professor at American River College, and he is the president of Los Rios Federation of Teachers. Welcome, Dean. And we'll start by 3 questions for Dean. So we'll turn over the floor to Dean. Do we have him on the recording, hopefully? So our first question for Dean is, how is the Los Rios district handling the deferrals for this year?
So yeah, we're trying our best. So the issue is that our calculation of deferrals is going to be over about $60 million or more, about $60 to $65 million is what we estimate. Our total reserves in our district is $38 million. So the amount of deferrals is way beyond anything that our district reserves could even imagine to match. And of course, you need reserves in case of emergencies and other things as well. So you just can't use it all for that purpose. So we're going to have to borrow the money, and that we've known that. We've borrowed the money. We'll be borrowing the money, but that comes at a cost that we'll have to absorb like 2 to 3%. And but we know that, and so that's how we're going to be handling the deferrals. We do understand that we will get the money back over the course of 5 months until November is when we get the final installment back again. But again, it's a long time to try and handle deferrals over that period of time. and keep our system running, particularly our salaries and benefits and things like that, which also increase in cost every year. So, we have deep concerns about deferrals, about what's going to happen next year, because as you note, next year's budget, the following year, it'll start off with a $1.5 billion deficit already for community colleges. And so do we expect revenues to all of a sudden increase to offset that $1.5 billion? Right now, if you take a look at the way things are moving, I don't think so. So we have very, very deep concerns about, we will handle this budget year and we'll get through it, but it's the following budget year that we have deep concerns with, and that's what we're warning our faculty about.
Thanks, Dean. I'll go ahead and I'm sure you saw up there the second question, which you more or less addressed. Did you want to say anything more specific about next year?
Okay. Well, so we know that in the spring, we'll probably sometime this month we'll come out with a decision that we will be online for the spring semester. There's no two ways about that. Things aren't going to change enough for us, because most of us are scheduling and everything else. Those decisions have to be made very early in this semester. And so, we can't anticipate that things are going to clear up in that amount of time. And so, we are, and I'm warning our faculty and very concerned, sort of moves into the other question as well, is that this is what I want people to really understand, is that, when we closed down and we've had the pandemic in March to the end of the fiscal year, June 30th, that resulted in a $54 billion deficit in our budget, the state budget. Okay, that's 3.5 months. When we take a look at next year, this situation of this pandemic recession is going to occur over a period of 12 months. If 3.5 months resulted in a $54 billion deficit, what's 12 months of this going to look like, and how's that going to affect our system and our revenues for the following year? So, we've warned everybody that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what kind of federal stimulus is going to happen. It's hard to anticipate. We tell people, don't get too excited yet. Don't get too panicked yet. But the reality is that a lot of things are going to be on the table next year, because the budget situation could be very dire. And that's what I've warned our faculty about. It's a very dangerous situation that we see with the budget, and I don't see how it's going to change.
Okay. Well,
especially since our legislatures haven't had the backbone to pass a wealth tax to try and compensate for the loss of revenues that we're going to see. And by the time they actually try and do it, or even if they could, probably will not get a 2/3 vote in both houses. It'll go on to an initiative, and that will be the following year. And then the year after that, it'll finally, maybe if it gets passed, will get funded. It's already too late. It's way too late.
Thanks. Well, that's coming from you, especially Dean, who's often looking on the brighter side of things, or we're getting the message. So with that, I'll just ask you the third question here, and then we'll open the floor to our Q&A. How can the faculty prepare for our advocacy this fall?
Yeah, so, I think that we've done as best that we can to educate our faculty about what's going to be happening in this budget. We've taken a look at what our priorities are, and try to get people to understand, here are the priorities, here are the changes. What kinds of changes can we make that will affect the budget? If we have to really reduce down our budget significantly, we've been having those discussions. One of the things that we've done is that we meet with the Academic Senate regularly, and to try and coordinate, make sure we're all faculty are on the same page, or try to meet these issues together collectively. Also, I meet with our classified union folks regularly, almost every week, that we meet together along with with our chancellor to talk about the issues and things that are coming up, or what we think might happen in the future, just to make sure that as a system, all of us as faculty and classified, academic senate, union, and administration, that we're all transparent, we're all on the same page together. We've instituted what we call our workload committees on every college, to make sure that if there are reductions or things that have to happen, that it's done in a transparent manner, that faculty have input, classified have input, and everybody has because everybody has a stake in all of this. We've also instituted our safety committees, our local safety committees, as we try and reopen, as we try and take a look at what are the benchmarks that we have to meet before we would even consider reopening and becoming safe. And even if it becomes safe, what about, a number of our faculty probably will not feel safe. We have to figure out what we're going to do with that as well in that situation and make accommodations. So we're taking a look at a whole host of accommodations that we'll probably have to make as we contemplate reopening, but also with the budget realities. All this is coming all at one time. And so it's a very difficult situation, try to navigate between the pandemic situation, the budget situation, and of course the social justice situation that's also here. All three of those things all at once. We're trying to meet all of those demands over the summer and now into the semester. So it's a huge task. It really has been a huge task. I'm sure this is the same for everybody across the state.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let us open the floor to the Q&A that we've already received. And then for others who are still with us, please, and there are many of you, please don't be shy and send us your questions in the Q&A. And I'll also invite back to the table Stephanie and Evan to answer these questions as well. So the first question I have for you is the deficit factor applied in 2020 to 2019-20 or 2021? And can you clarify what that means for local districts? So whoever would like to take that one.
Yeah, I'll grab this one. Thanks, Debbie. So yes, it's the current fiscal year we're in right now, which is 2020-21. That's where it would be applied to. How it impacts local districts, I think in a number of ways. I'll try to articulate this to sort of, and sort of just with hypotheticals, but hopefully we'll give you an idea. So say your district was expecting $100 million in state apportionment, right? That's what they were expecting after the budget signed. That's what they were working off of. Now that state apportionment, of course, included all the deferrals as well, right? So it won't be that they'll be getting that $100 million immediately. It'll be over time once the deferrals kick in. Okay, so that's the $100 million. So it's a 1 to 2% decrease, right, in what they were expecting in their state apportionment off of that number. So that's what it's going to mean for local districts. It's basically 1 to 2% less in state apportionment that a district can expect to get. So hopefully that clarifies it. And again, that's in the year that we are currently in right now, which is of course 2020-21.
Thanks, Evan. Next question here we have, if the state has to defer funding, how does the state treasurer's office have money to lend to districts?
This is a great question. This one made me laugh. So thank you for whoever wrote it in. It's the way state government works, I guess. It's kind of interesting looking at this. So essentially what it is just different pots of money. So the state treasurer's office has what's called, again, Tran Funding here. And it's a specific pot of money that the state puts aside for local districts, not only community college districts, but K through 12 districts, city councils, for example, right, local governments, to tap into when they have unexpected losses, either from deferrals, which is a great example, or loss of property tax. So essentially the treasurer's office in the state puts this money aside every year to be able to have this for local governments to tap into. And there are some stipulations with it. They have to be paid back. I think it's in 13 months. So there are some limitations to it that would be different than borrowing elsewhere. But there are some benefits as well. They often will come at maybe a lower interest rate, and or that interest rate will be won't have any sort of taxes connected to it. Oftentimes the origination fees will be either waived or postponed. So they are better options, I think, often for local governments to tap into. And because this is something that obviously the deferrals are very pronounced this year, but this is something that happens somewhat regularly, there is this program of Tran for every year. Basically, it's funded, so the money is there when it's needed. And that's why that money is there and is, again, separate, a completely separate pot of money than what would be accessible for funding community colleges. So I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit sort of interesting how that works, but it's just the nature of how the different pots of money are funded within our state budget process.
Thanks, Evan. Next question here. Could you elaborate on the inclusion of the Lieutenant Governor in the CCC Board of Governors?
Absolutely, and I'll grab that one as well. So the Board of Governors is a board mostly appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate for many of the positions to oversee the Chancellor's office, of course, which is our regulatory agency in the community colleges. And right now, the makeup of the board, you have a couple faculty members on there, a couple students, you have a number of community members, folks that have relationships with the governor who have worked in the community college system, those who have not as well. In fact, many who have not worked in the community college system. And those make up the folks that serve on the board. There isn't any elected official that's on the board. So this is going to be interesting. This is going to be brand new, something that we haven't experienced. And again, as I mentioned, there is an elected official serving on the UC and CSU. So again, it's sort of the idea behind this is to, if you're going to have lieutenant governors serve on the other systems of higher education, they should serve on the community college as well. So basically, there'll be one voice on the board. They'll have one vote, like everyone else does, is my understanding. And I think the upshot here is it's nice to have someone on the board again who is in sort of that particular position of power. Hopefully, that increases our presence, our ability to utilize whoever the lieutenant governor is in bringing more funding to our system, right? Bringing the attention to our system, those sort of things. And having lieutenant governor much more involved in sort of, again, not necessarily the day-to-day things happening at the system office, but some of the bigger issues that happen in the regulatory space that oftentimes policymakers are not aware of, to be honest. So to have someone sitting there and hearing it, during the meetings, I think can have an interesting impact. So it'll be interesting to see what it looks like. Certainly FAC is every single board meeting, advocating on behalf of all of you, on our behalf of our members, to make sure faculty priorities are heard and implemented, and we'll have someone else that will be advocating to and speaking with during the process. So it will be really interesting to see how it shakes out. Thanks,
Evan. And I wanted to mention a comment that was made in the Q&A and then another question. And so I'm glad our colleague and fellow board member wrote this comment in, and that is that the AB 895 bill that would have raised the cap for part-time workload will be back. And it's a priority of CFT, and FAC was involved, of course, in the bill last year. And so it will be back in January, and we wanted to make sure that you all knew that. So there will still be another effort made to raise the cap on part-time workload from 67% to 80 to 85. And the question here is, if I'm understanding the question correctly, how are the deficit factors applied to our categoricals? And I think that's probably a question for Evan.
Yeah, and I'm reading the question in there as well. I know mentioning the deficit factor for 1920. So when it comes to the way that the state has set it up now is essentially you have you have deferrals, and then you have again the deficit factor. The categoricals will be impacted a little bit differently. So state apportionment is specifically like the base funding that goes to community college districts within the state budget. There is a specific amount within the budget that was passed that is supposed to go to categoricals, right? So that amount won't change. So whatever that amount is, whatever categorical it is, I don't know it off the top of my, like every categorical off the top of my head, that amount will be paid in deferrals at some point to the community college district. So the deficit factor is about the state apportionment specifically. And, I see the question about sort of 2019-20 versus 2020-21. Specifically, Kathy, I can talk to you about what that sort of looks like. But overall, I mean, the point I made earlier, I think, is the same, that there is sort of the expected amount that the state had. The chancellor's office then looks at numbers that come in from property tax and other things and says, actually, there's not quite that amount because, again, property tax came in lower, right? Reimbursement of student fees. Therefore, district, you should expect, X percentage less than what the state apportionment number was out of the state budget. So that's essentially what it boils down to. It's much more nuanced than that, of course, but trying to just quickly explain what that looks like. I hope that the best way of explaining it. And again, I'm happy to sort of have kind of a one-on-one conversation here about what's happening in your district and then kind of connect the dots there if that would be helpful. So certainly reach out to me directly. I know many of you have my contact information, but please utilize info@fac.org, send us a note and we can connect on some of these issues in more detail.
Thanks, Evan. And one of these questions was sort of a comment, but I'll turn it into a question for Dean here. And that is, last time there was a big budget crisis in the 90s, there was some discussion among districts that the first step would be to look at faculty layoffs. And I'm sure the districts are discussing a number of possibilities, but Dean, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what that, on that possibility.
Well, I'll just say everything will be on the table, but that would be the absolutely last resort of full-time layoffs. There's no doubt that if we have a reduction, it's going to hurt our part-time faculty tremendously because we will be cutting classes by whatever percent it might happen to be, and that falls directly on the shoulders of our part-time faculty, unfortunately. Every district will have to make that decision about whether they will reduce force and actually reduce the number of full-time faculty on their own. It's not a system-wide decision. I will say that in the last time in working with our districts, we were able to borrow off of the reserves to make sure that we did not lay off any full-time faculty member or any full-time classified member, and also maintain the salary schedule so there's no reduction in salary. We would expect the same thing to happen this time, depending on how big of a deficit we're going to be facing. We will do everything we can in Los Rios anyway to make sure that that would be the very, very, very last thing that we would consider. And of course, we just have to see how bad it's going to be. So I'm not going to, like I said, those issues are on the table. But right now, until I see the reality, I don't want to respond to it or get too caught up in all of that beforehand, because I just need to see what the actual numbers, the actual consequences of the budget deficit will be, and then we will deal with it right then and there. But believe me, our priorities and what to cut and how to cut, we've had these discussions for the last, ever since March. We have had these discussions in our union meeting all the time, and so it is highlighted on us. And I work with the district almost every week to talk about budget issues. So that's what you have to do, as transparent as possible. Make sure that you talk with your Vice Chancellor of Finance to make sure to get the budget picture, what's going on, what the actual numbers are, make sure they coincide, and you work with that. And so I know exactly what the budget is. I know how much money comes into Los Rios. I know how the money is divided and where the pots go. And so, I know what I have to work with, and the deficit that I find is real,
Thanks, Dean. What are your thoughts on the idea or concept of a workload reduction? And maybe for our audience, you could help define that.
So workload reduction basically means you basically work more for the same amount of money. And that's what that basically means. And, you know, we did that last time because, you know, we had a lot of districts that had a lot of unfunded students. And so we were able to absorb that pretty easily. And it does help in certain ways in order for districts to meet their budgets. I'm not quite sure. We'll have to talk about when we see now we're in declining enrollment, which is the reality. In Los Rios, we're right about, and it's partly because we're all online. It's we have an 8.5% reduction from last year in students, and so we'll have to see how workload reduction works in this situation now. But the key was what I think was Jack Scott was the chancellor at that time. It says you could reduce our funding per FTES is basically what that means, but we have enough FTES to go ahead and claim the same amount of money. So it prevented a reduction of money. Right now, I don't know if that's the same situation that we have this time around.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for you. And I know that the funding formula we have right now, as I said earlier, isn't really working. And of course, it's not even fully funded. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But do you have any thoughts about what another more equitable or fair funding formula might look like?
Well, you know, I think that again, you know, the previous funding formula that we had put together earlier took a look at not only your FTES, the number of students enrollment, but also it had factors such as incoming high school students, what your high school enrollments look like. Also, it had whether you're in a low income area and how much of an income area you serve. It had those factors in there before coming out with the final estimate. Now, this one has taken that to a larger extent. And with the if we got rid of performance-based funding, I think the student demographics part is one of the major factors that has shifted so much money away from urban districts into more rural districts. And so I don't think it was anticipated, unfortunately, because they didn't test it out, how much of a shift this would be and the burden it would place upon our urban districts, whether it's Los Angeles or San Francisco or the Bay Area. It has really hurt those districts a lot. And this is the unfortunate part of when you don't test your formulas to see what's going to happen. And coming up with a formula that does account for, you know, I have no problem saying that districts that serve more needy students need to help more. I have no issue there. It's just how do you come up with a fair amount and how you formula for doing that. And unfortunately, the state chancellor's office did not come up with one that you could tell was fair, that really hurt a lot of districts tremendously.
Thank you, Dean. And I'm here, we're getting close to time, but we have a couple more minutes here. Any thoughts about a reduction in, and I'm just reading from the question here, quote, non-revenue producing administration positions to cut expenses?
For us, I'll just say for Los Rios, the percent that goes to administration is fixed. So we are in our bucket system, there's a fixed percentage that goes to administration, fixed percentage that goes to classified, and fixed percentage that goes to the faculty. So that has not changed, and that will not change for us. So they have to live within that, although I will say that from categorical funds, they do hire a lot of administrators off of those funds.
Yeah.
But that's separate from our salary, our benefits funds, right? Our general fund.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean. Well, with that, I think we've covered most of the questions. Some of the questions we have let folks know that we'll be answering more one-on-one, but I would like this chance to ask if you had any final comments, thoughts, words of wisdom to shed before we go to our final slide.
I will just say, you know, to Dean's point, I mean, we have some challenging times ahead of us. I think this year we're able to dodge a bullet, you know, with the deferrals, which obviously have its challenges as well. I think many of us had hoped that we'd be looking at a much better economic picture. We would have, you know, we would have done a better job, I guess, as a country responding to coronavirus, and we would be back. And I think that was part of the strategy. In addition, we were expecting a little bit more from the federal government, but things changed quickly. The COVID situation could change quickly. We could have a new administration in Washington, D.C. in just a few months. So things change. So I think there's some reasons to certainly be optimistic, but also be prepared for what's going to be ahead of us. And I think the thing that we can all do now is strengthen ourselves as faculty leaders, to empower ourselves to be prepared for those challenges, be prepared for those fights that we're going to have in the coming months. And but even before that, we have just such a consequential election. And, you know, we talked about revenue. You know, if Prop 15 passes, it's going to make January look a lot better. So that is really the thing we can do right now at this very moment. I would actually say there's two things. So right now at this very moment, do whatever you can to get Proposition 15 passed. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your folks in your community. They support the community college. I think a lot of them don't understand how underfunded we are as a system. And I think they can, you know, with these sorts of one-on-one conversations, folks that maybe are even on the fence can hopefully come around to supporting Prop 15. And then additionally, at this moment, reach out to your members of Congress. Certainly in California, our folks are mostly supportive of bringing federal money into our state, but you got to kind of put the pressure on, and we have action alerts and things on our website that can really help you engage with your members of Congress. So I think there's a lot that can be done right now, and I appreciate you all being part of the fight, you know, joining this webinar, being engaged on top of everything else you have going on in your lives. But this work is really critical, and that's why, of course, you support our organization and being your voice in the spaces and the conversations where decisions get made. So we encourage you to continue to support us. We appreciate your support. And then finally, I think there was one question, and I know, Stephanie, you said you were going to answer this, but maybe I'll answer it since I'm speaking right now. There's a question about a bill by Assembly Member Weber that had to do with affirmative action, and that was ACA 5, and that turned into the initiative, Prop 16. So basically, there had to be a piece of legislation to turn it into the initiative. So they are one and the same. But because it's a constitutional amendment, it has to go to the voters. Prop 209 was constitutional as well, right? So it has to go back to the voters. And so that bill was basically the process to get us to this moment where we're at right now. And now it's up to the voters, and we have almost exactly 2 months until the election. So wanted to kind of do a little bit of my final words there since I had some time.
Thank you, Evan. And Stephanie, any final words from you?
Sure. You know, just reiterate everything Evan said about Prop 15, Prop 16. It's super important that we get people out there voting and supporting those propositions. Additionally, there was one question about bills and supporting the millionaires' taxes or sponsoring them. Just as a point of clarification, the process that we have at FACC for bills and deciding which bills we're going to sponsor or support, it goes through our Ledge Committee first. They make some recommendations to our board, and then our board decides where to go from there. I will say that we'll definitely be engaging in the tax bills next year. They're incredibly important, particularly as we're looking at another potential deficit for the coming year. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie, Evan, and Dean. And just for my last words here, I'll ask for the next slide and mention a figure. I don't know if this was said out loud yet here today, but if Prop 15 were to pass, we would be looking at somewhere around 300 to 500 million more for our system per year. So that's a significant amount of money. And the other thing I wanted to mention, aside from echoing all of my colleagues here, is that FACC has a student engagement task force, and we've been working closely through our PAC, our Political Action Committee, with our student interns up and down the system, and engaging our students on these campaigns. So in your classrooms, if you haven't already, feel free to help your students get in touch with the campaigns. We can offer extra credit. We can also help hook them up through FACC, actually, with our Political Action Committee if they want to be involved and know how to get involved. And as you know, we have 2.1 million students, so and they also are adults, so they are voting, and we are doing some voter registration pushing and registering in our organization, but also through our PAC and our classes. So, so with that, next steps that we haven't already covered are here on the slide. Please read our weekly. It comes every Saturday in your mail, via email. Our action alerts are really easy to get to with our new website. So hopefully you've seen that. Just click on action alerts and you have all of the pre-written letters, including our letter to the governor about Calbright, right there for you to fill out. Like Dean has been advocating, please be vigilant locally. Call upon us if you want us to visit locally. We're good for that. We've been having really exciting local visits via Zoom these days. And don't forget to send your follow-up questions to info@FACC. And please join if you haven't already. We will do everything that we can with your help and fight the good fight for our students, our faculty, and our communities. Thank you for joining today.